Well, Todd asked me to talk about the impact or effects of the flood on crawfish production. And as you might expect, we've gotten a lot of questions since the flood, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions too. I don't know that we have all the answers, but I'd like to kind of go through some of the cause-effect relationships that the flood may or may not have on your crawfish production. Now, the media, the Louisiana media, was calling this the Great Flood. So that may be a good moniker for this flood. But before I get into that, let me just ask you, how many of y'all feel like the flood has definitely impacted your situation? Or are you afraid it has impacted your situation? A lot of people? Okay. Let me also ask you, how many of you got the highest water in your crawfish ponds directly from rainfall as opposed to backwater flooding? You can't hear it? Okay, I'll try to talk slower and more into my mic. Okay. Okay. I was asking, how many of you feel like you got the most water in your crawfish ponds directly from rainfall as opposed to backwater flooding that came up after the rain ceased? Who feels like they got most of the water or the highest water from flooding? Okay, some of you, and I guess the rest of you had problems with backwater flooding, because that may make a difference, and I'll show that to you how that may or may not make a difference as we go through the slide. Let me just start and say that rainfall or clean water is not directly detrimental to crawfish. Crawfish is an aquatic species. Crawfish like water. They thrive in good quality water. So it's not the rainfall and it's not the flooding per se that gives you the problem. We have to look at this from two different perspectives. First is, from an aquaculture standpoint, what does the flood water do to the life cycle processes that Greg was just talking about? That's probably the primary way that you're going to have negative impacts from the storm. The second method or means of negative impact is going to come from where that flood water interferes with your ability to manage that pond in a timely fashion. So let's just kind of go through these. You should know, and I think Greg alluded to this, that all of your brood crawfish, your females, your reproductive females, are burrowed in on the levees, and usually above the watermark on the levees. During the summertime, late spring, when the water temperature is hot, crawfish don't burrow underwater. They can, but they typically don't. They're going to burrow at or above the water line. So any crawfish that burrows down in your pond bottom after you drained your pond are probably males. They may be immature crawfish. They're not your reproductive females. And even those may, if you have if you flood your fields for rice or keep your fields flooded for rice, they're not going to be able to thrive down in there. And even if you get normal summertime rainfalls that hold 2 or 3 inches of rain on your fields, the crawfish are not going to be able to stay there. As Greg mentioned, crawfish are actually trapped in that burrow until that mud plug softens enough for them to escape. They can't escape at will. They've got to have water somehow or another to soften that plug. So any crawfish that's burrowed up on the levees, if you get enough rainfall, or in this case a flood, if that flood gets over where those reproductive females are burrowed into that levee, they can come out, but they're also forced to come out. And the reason they're forced to leave that burrow or evacuate that burrow is because, particularly that time of year, and probably just about any time of year down here in the south, they are not able to stay in that burrow because there's just not enough oxygen exchanged in that water. In other words, they'll quickly use up what oxygen is in that flooded burrow, and they have to come out or they'll die. So floods that get up above where most of those crawfish are burrowed forces those crawfish out of the burrows. Now, what happens to them when they're forced out of the burrows? Well, that may depend on how deep the flood got, how long it stayed on your fields, and the timing of the flood. We've done some research, and crawfish that are forced out of the burrow before they spawn, they typically tend to find another burrow, go down into, dig another burrow. We've actually documented from experimental basis that crawfish that were forced to evacuate the burrow 6 times had no negative impact on their subsequent reproduction. But what happens is, when we get a flood, particularly floods that top the levee, what are those crawfish going to do that come out of the burrows? Some of them are going to leave the field, particularly if that water quality gets so bad. If you end up with a lot of decomposition going on in there, if that water stays on your field, you can't get that water off, those crawfish are not going to stay inside that field with all the bad water. They're going to get out of the field. Now, the opposite can be true. Some of the crawfish that are burrowed outside the field, like in bordering ditches and even neighboring fields, some of those that are forced out of their burrows may actually find their way into your pond, particularly if water quality is acceptable or when you flood up later. So you got this whole dynamic that's going on, and it's going to be different from farm to farm and pond to pond. But when those crawfish are forced out of the burrow, you're going to lose some, albeit you may gain some. The population is typically highest inside that burrow, so you may end up losing more than you gain. If this occurs at the time of spawning or about the time of spawning, spawning is interrupted. And I mentioned that Greg asked about peak spawning. Well, peak spawning occurs, that first wave of spawning occurs late August, early September. That's the peak. We've actually documented some spawning that takes place in late July. Of course, spawning means egg laying. Then there's about 3 weeks before those eggs are hatched, and then those crawfish are actually physically attached to that female even after they're hatched for about 10 days or 2 weeks. So it's at least 5 weeks from spawning before those little crawfish are ready to leave the mama. So all of this, if this is going on at the time that flooding takes place, this whole process is interrupted, and it's not a good thing. As Greg mentioned, those crawfish have evolved to reproduce down in that burrow, and when they're forced out of that burrow, that's not good. If females that have already spawned and ready to release young, if they release their young in that water in the pond, and the water quality cannot be maintained, those little crawfish are going to die. So you're going to lose that batch of crawfish. And many of those females may not be able to stay in that pond if you can't get that water off pretty quick, particularly if it's bad water quality. Those females that are laden with eggs, in other words, eggs are attached to her tail, and in many cases, when the young, even though they're hatched, they're still attached for about 10 days. Those females are more susceptible to predators, birds, fish, whatever, because their typical escape response, as you all observed, I'm sure, is a quick flapping of the tail. That's how they get away from predators. You know, they flick backwards. Well, if their tail is laden with eggs or young, they can't do that, so they're more susceptible. So there's all kind of bad things can happen when those females are forced out of their preferred reproductive space prematurely. And again, I'll emphasize that these negative impacts may not be the same for everybody. The worst case scenario is when water tops that levee and when it stays on for a long time. Some of you may have experienced that. Some of you hopefully were lucky enough to not experience that. Okay, the other factor I mentioned is all of these impacts on your ability to manage that pond. And let's just kind of go through them real quick like here. Obviously, when those levees are breached, when water tops those levees, you're going to get fish inside your pond. It's almost invariable. And those fish, they may not look very harmful, but it's been estimated that every one of those little sunfish during a season can eat enough small baby crawfish to equal about a sack of crawfish had those baby crawfish grown up and been harvested. So for every fish you have out in your pond, even these little sunfish, you could potentially lose a sack of crawfish. So what happens if you get hundreds or even thousands of fish in your pond? It's not a pretty sight. Number two, the ability of that flood to impact your management of the forage crop. If you were late for some reason and hadn't been able to get a forage crop planted or established, water stood over that forage crop, or you happen to have a young forage crop established that you may lose because of the deep flood. Obviously, you're not going to have any groceries or adequate groceries for crawfish. That's mainly in a like a permanent type pond, or when rice is planted in August for crawfish. But it could impact other forage management schemes. If water stays on that field too long, you could change the forage species of that field. In other words, if you got a lot of grass that can't stand that flooded condition, it's going to die. It's going to die quick. Some of the aquatics may be okay, but it's those full aquatics that are probably not your best type of forage crop for crawfish. So flooding could change the species composition. Also, if that flood water gets too high and stays on too long, you may lose a lot of tonnage or biomass of your desirable forage crops. When you get a rice crop like this that's going down, it's almost not going to recover. On the other end of things, that flood occurred mid-August, and by that time, down here in these parishes, most of the rice, first crop rice, had already been harvested. So at the time of the flood, a lot of these fields, probably many of your fields, had just been cut, rice had been cut. You got all this straw and combine debris in your fields. That flood may do you a favor in that respect, because that water at that time of year, covering all of that dry material, starts decomposition. And the object is, if we can get a lot of that decomposition out of the way before regular flood occurs, that's typically a desirable thing. So on the other hand, extended flood can be very damaging, but it also has some benefits. So again, the dynamics gets really complicated. You know, how much do the bad aspects are offset with the good aspects? So it's from farm to farm. Obviously, anytime you got decomposition going on, particularly out there in the hot summertime, you're going to have poor water quality. And the longer that water stays on, the worse that water quality gets. And any crawfish that are forced to come out in that field may have a hard time, particularly the young of the year. So You got all of these things that keep you from managing that pond the way you would like to manage it. But management after the fact is probably just as important, in some cases more important. How you handle or what you're able to do after the flood. Obviously, you want to get that pond drained as soon as you can and drained completely. The longer you keep that water on there, the worse that some of these management concerns can get. Water quality, for example. The longer that water stays on, it's not going to get any better. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse. The longer that water stays on, the more it can damage your crop, your forage crop. You can get water on, get it off. That gives that forage a chance to recover. But if it's flooded deep and you can't get that water off, that's worst case scenario. You're going to lose the forage crop potentially. Fish population control. You're going to get fish in your ponds, and the only way to get them out is to drain that pond and let that pond go dry before the crawfish season. Again, what you don't want to see are thousands and thousands of these little bullheads or sunfish or whatever in your pond, eating your crawfish, but not only that, getting in your trap, causing problems. So you got to get that water off as soon as you can. You want that water to dry. You don't want little puddles to stay where these fish can ride out the short dry period. So management after the fact is the key as well. Now, I'd like to show you using some real data. Some of you may have seen these charts before. Some of you obviously haven't. But what I want to show you is the potential impact using real data that's generated at the rice station on how losing these early recruits, how it can impact your system. Now, let me just take a minute to explain this chart. We did a study, and this was over a 2-year period, in which we stocked little bitty half-inch crawfish. We stocked these in enclosures out in fields, and we measured the growth of these crawfish for 3 months. Each month we retrieved the crawfish, we weighed them, put them back. So we looked at the growth rate of these crawfish, where we stocked them each month, beginning in October, and let's see, going through March, I guess. And the height of these bars, my little pointer's not working, but the height of these bars represent the average weight of crawfish for that month. And if you notice the yellow, those are the crawfish we stocked in October. The reds are ones we stocked in November. Again, these were half-gram animals, just about 2-3 weeks off the female. And we did this all the way through March. What I want to point out here is you see the October, I'm going to call them recruitment wave. The October recruits grew pretty fast. Water temperature was warm, or is warm that time of year. They grow pretty fast. The ones stocked in November grow slower. Those that stocked in December, after 3 months, they wasn't very big. Now, what does this mean? Well, the average, the minimum size of crawfish acceptable in the marketplace is about 15 grams. A crawfish has to get up to about 15 grams before it can be acceptable. So we're using that as a threshold. And what this chart shows is the little number in the red box above. That is the percent of those crawfish that were above 15 grams at the termination of that stocking period. So in October, what is that? I can't see it here. 50% or so, 56%, 54%, whatever, had reached minimum harvest size by, actually that's January. So what I want to show is, in this case, you may be able to harvest a smaller percent beginning in December. Certainly you'll be harvesting a 50+% of those first recruits in January, and then whatever you don't harvest in January certainly would be big enough to harvest in February. So what I want to show is what happens if we lose that first wave, that October recruitment class. See, you get, I don't know, what is that? 16%. So your first harvest that's going to come in February is going to be only that 16% of that November recruitment class. So that puts you pretty late. Now, whether that impacts your overall annual production or not, it may or may not. You could possibly make up on the poundage later on, but that certainly throws you late. But look what happens if you lose that October and November crop. None of those crawfish, none of those half-gram crawfish stocked in December was of harvest size after 3 months. So now, if you lose your October recruitment and your November recruitment, you're not going to get any crawfish till way late. So that's just a visual of what can happen, and that's an illustration of why it's so important to try to take advantage of these early recruits to the best of your ability. Now, the silver lining of all of this, if there is such a thing, is that all farms did not experience the worst of the flooding. So this flooding, the Great Flood of 2016, is probably going to be felt more on some of you, and others may not notice much at all. So I can't tell you across the board whether your pond's going to be affected or not. It just all depends on all of these complicated dynamics. Now, luckily, as Greg mentioned, all these crawfish are not synchronized in their reproductive cycle. So you're going to have waves of recruitment well beyond that first couple of waves. The red swamp crawfish can spawn at any time of the year, it does, and so you're going to have subsequent waves that can help fill the gaps. So even if you did have a big negative impact from the flood that affects that early wave of recruits, you could make up somewhat later on. Also, all crawfish were not in the reproductive state at the time of the flood, so those are going to be impacted less. Now, here's something else to think about too. In a normal year where we've got extended dry spells during the summer, a certain percent of your brood crawfish is going to die, or maybe not spawn, or lose their young in the burrows during dry periods. What I'm hoping is that we've had a wet year all summer long up to this point. We've been exceptionally wet. So what I'm hoping is that we've got high enough survival of broodstock, high enough spawning success, and a high enough survival of those young to where that offsets some of those that we lost in the flood. So hopefully there's going to be an offset. And if that's the case, then your production may not look as grim as it would otherwise. So just keep that in mind. And for those of you who still may be awake, if you have any questions over what I just presented, I'll be glad to answer them. I understand we're going to have another question and answer period later, but if someone has a burning question or two in response to this, I'll be glad to try to answer.